You're listening to the RFP Success Show with 8-time author, speaker, and CEO of the RFP Success Company, Lisa REHUREK. Tune in each episode to learn what today's capture and RFP teams are doing to increase their win percentages by up to 20, 30, and even 50%, and meet the industry trailblazers that are getting it right. Let's get started.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the RFP Success Show podcast. I am your host, Lisa REHUREK, founder and CEO of the RFP Success Company. And I'd like to introduce you to our guest for today's episode, Don Carmichael. He's Chief PreSales Evangelist at Winning Skills. Welcome, Don.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Gosh, you've done so many podcast episodes. It's amazing. Thank you so much for the invite. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. You know, for listeners, I was following Don on LinkedIn, and he was talking a lot about negotiation. And I thought, man, we got to have him on the show because there is a lot. I think in the world of RFPs, you think there is no negotiation really until you get to the BAFO, but I disagree with that. I think there's plenty of opportunity for negotiation. So I'm excited to have you on. And why don't we kick this off by having you tell our listeners a little bit more about, you know, what you do, who you are, a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I'm going to have to define something very quickly, but I was going to say I've been in pre-sales for about 35 years, and you're going to ask, what's that? So basically in the technology world, so in your SAPs, your Oracles, Microsoft, Salesforce, those kind of companies, and when they go selling, there's normally at least two roles involved in it. One would be an account executive, a salesperson who's purely about kind of selling, doing the contract side of things, politics, navigating their way around the buyers, the stakeholders. But there's also normally a person who is like a technology specialist who understands technology, but also understands how that technology is used in the client's industry or domain. In fact, their knowledge really has to be kind of equal amounts of that. I think the American expression is, well, you've got to be stone cold, got to know the technology stone cold. Is that right? Sorry, from the accent, people will probably work out I'm actually from the UK. So some of these Americanisms not 100% sure of. So this technology person, there's an umbrella term for it, which is pre-sales. It's basically a consultant, a technology consultant who's involved before the sale happens. It's actually quite an archaic term anymore. We only really use it as an umbrella term because the challenge we have in our industry and profession is that we've got probably hundreds of different job titles, things like technical architect, solution consultant. In the US, you see lots of people called sales engineers or SEs. There's different reasons for that in different technology companies. It might be better to be called like a cloud architect. In other companies, engineer works. But there's also geography and cultural things, which is as you go outside the USA, there are certain countries where you can't use the word engineer unless you really are qualified as an engineer. So my world has been these people who are working with salespeople in the sales cycle, but they're the technology experts. So I've worked my way up lots of enterprise resource planning companies, you'd call them. Mm-hmm. So large software companies, eventually at SAP. So SAP's, I don't know, kind of number one, number two, as it were, in the kind of large, enterprise level software arena. I've also worked at Oracle, who's probably whatever. If SAP aren't number one, Oracle are number one. One of those kind of things. Yeah, and the major roles there is evolving to be head of pre-sales enablement. So it's basically looking at how do you train pre-sales people, what is best practices, how do you measure what they're doing, but also moving into things like RFPs as well, because pre-sales people in technology company tend to primarily be the people who are answering RFPs. Well, certainly the technology questions, once you've kind of stripped an RFP down, they may not write the executive overview of the win theme, but they would certainly contribute to it. But they, hours, days worth of time answering RFPs. And before I joined SAP, I used to work with lots of partner companies, and I've hundreds of RFPs I've done it. I used to absolutely hate them, and I've kind of quite famous these days for writing articles about what a utter waste of time they are in the technology world, which doesn't earn me many friends in the kind of RFP consulting world. But my core argument with that, though, is that RFPs are actually very difficult to write.
Yes.
Because how do you know where technology is going? If a client's written them and you haven't had a consultant help you, if you're writing it, you'll tend to write it from the perspective of the technology and things you understand. So one of the articles I wrote was a good example of that would be Henry Ford, who famously said, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So I jokingly said, well, what would have happened if Henry Ford had to answer RFPs to sell Model T Fords? Because the RFP questions would be things like, how many hooves has it got? How far does it travel to a bag of hay? Do you see what I mean?
Yes,
Because
yes.
that's how people would have viewed the world. And he would have, and we're going to go on to kind of, negotiating as part of RFPs. That's a classic case of you can't say a Model T Ford. You couldn't say, how far does it go to a bag of hay? Well, you obviously can't say yes because it doesn't work on a bag of hay. But but you're moving into an area you don't really want to say no. What you want to do is re-guide the question and say, well, actually, I know you're interested in how many bags of hay, but actually in this case it works with a thing called petroleum. So you have to negotiate your way around the hay question. I'm being quite flippant there, but that's an interesting example of sometimes what happens with RFPs, and certainly in the technology world, the challenge we have is they're asking questions, but it doesn't work like that. The question you've asked, that's not how it's been in the last 10 years. We handle security in a very different way. And it's how, you've asked me a question that's got a yes and a no and a comment on it. It's really difficult for me because I don't want to say no. What I want to do is re-guide you, negotiate you around that wasn't the right question in the first place.
Right. Well, that's an interesting segue into the conversation around negotiation, right? So Don is a negotiation expert, and I wanted to have this conversation around negotiation. And so it's a very odd conversation around RFPs because most people think, well, there's no negotiation in RFPs unless we get to the BAFO stage of that, best and final, and then maybe there's some negotiation there. But what would you say is, well, actually, I'm going to start a little bit more at the beginning, but what kind of positions need to even understand the whole world of negotiation? Is it just sales? And if it's sales, what positions within sales really need to be good at negotiation?
To be honest, this is going to sound like a cliche, but because everybody's, if you really, really think about it, everyone's negotiating all the time. I mean, quite flippant to say, your children, if you tidy your room, you can get 1 hour on the PlayStation. or my wife's version of that, which is if you tidy the office, you can have 1 hour on the PlayStation. but that's negotiating because that's at a simple level, it's a give and get. If I give you this, we'll get something back. Moving into negotiation skills, it gets a little bit more sophisticated that because certainly in an RFP world, there are things, and you negotiate, and there are things called zones of tolerance, which is I'd like this, but I know you want this, and it's how much do they overlap, and you can't go too far because that's well outside the other person's zone of tolerance. And again, dropping down in a give and get, you move into a world of what are called value exchanges, which is if to give the client something that moves them towards their goal, you might say, in exchange, do this. Now, the way a value exchange would work is you're looking for something that's low cost for you, but high value for them, that they would perceive as high value. So classic one of them, let's say in a technology sales situation, might be they're looking for something. You say, well, how about in exchange for that, we give you, let's say, a technology audit exercise. We'll come on site for 1 day and we'll do this technology, and it's worth, to us, that's worth this amount of money. But it isn't this worth a much lower cost. It's kind of 1 day, 1 day of a consultant's time. But, but to the client, something like that is worth, like, let's say 6 to 7 times what that value is. So a lot of negotiating is understanding, is having ready what these value exchanges are, understanding and having negotiating them up front, which in an RFP would probably be a lot to do with anticipating the kind of things that you're going to get asked in an RFP, because RFPs are all about speed, aren't they? As well, deadlines are always kind of looming. So you don't want to have too many discussions about these things. It would be better if you were kind of pre-prepared. And just to take that off in a little kind of tangential direction, which is in the technology world, one of the things we're really interested in at the moment is the rise of something called buyer enablement. So buyer enablement, the shorthand for it is, because consumer behaviors have come into the business world and consumers don't want to be sold to. They're subjected to 10,000 advertising messages a day. It just washes over them. So they don't want to be sold to. So to kind of resist or stop that happening, they're spending 70% of their buying journey doing their own research, looking at your website, finding out things for themselves, probably getting quite confused because they get overloaded with content. But 70% of the journey before they actually put their hand up and say, you can now sell to me. I am now a prospect. So the world of buyer enablement then is what happens next is you're not really selling to especially large organizations anymore. What you're actually doing is you should be coaching one of the buyers, the champion or the internal coach in the client. You should be coaching them or helping them to sell it internally. Do you see what I mean by that?
Yeah. So when you were talking, I was thinking, so is that true of like organization buying? So you're saying, because there's like a single person who is looking for, the sale here. They're looking for whatever they need to buy. That's very, very interesting. Yeah. So that
if it's a complex product or a complex sale, and there's a complex buying team, not just one person that you talk, but multiple people. And a lot of RFPs, if you've gone into the expense of doing an RFP, because of course it's an expense to the client, put it together, but also to analyze it and, make a decision on it afterwards. If they've gone into the expense of that, it's probably not one person buying it. It's a large team of people. And the challenge with that these days is you probably will only ever find out about, let's say, half of them, of the people involved in it. If even that. So, so the big world now is you can't sell to these people who are hidden. What you've got to do is you've got to anticipate their needs, and all this feeds into the RFP as well. So you've got to anticipate their needs and you've got to coach and enable the buyer to do the selling on your behalf. So the world of buyer enablement really changes your head around, what it is you do when you think you're selling, especially complex technology to enterprises. It goes away from selling. And I think we may come on to this as well, because this also impacts the language you use as well. And, the emotions that you're trying to do, which is, traditionally we've been kind of about fear and we've used words like pain, technical pains and, what's the functional pain? And it's a very particular type of language. And it comes from sales methodologies that are actually quite old. So there's one, is it Sandler, which is older than me.
Oh, yeah.
And for people who listen to the podcast, I'm pretty old. Just so check me out on LinkedIn.
Oh, he's not that old. Don't let him fool you.
I'm no spring chicken. So, that language has been inherent in selling for a very long time. And, in the world of buyer enablement, you've got to start changing. Some of this stuff has got to change, because it's not working for you anymore. So feeding into, RFPs, the whole kind of, where you are on the stage when an RFP comes along and who is on the other end of it, and anticipating the fact that the RFP is going to is for some people you will never get to meet, so you've got to, even so the language you use inside it and, and how you answer it and, understand sometimes you've got to move up a level and use kind of negotiation skills with people that are hidden. I think these things are, when you're answering things, sometimes I think things are a lot more complicated and sophisticated than you might immediately think, and just answering an RFP. There's probably a lot more going on and a lot more subtleties to questions. So, so things are a lot more complicated.
Yeah, things are more complicated. And it's interesting. If you've got a pretty sophisticated organization from a proposal perspective, and you've got a big team, and you've got a capture team and a proposal team, you probably understand all of that. Most of our listeners are more kind of the mid-market, and they don't necessarily have a huge built-in proposal team. And one of the things that we see a lot with our clients is that they come to us and they're like, we just found this RFP and we think that we're perfectly positioned to bid on it. And we're like, well, you're not perfectly positioned because you had no pre-conversations. So everything that you're talking about here, Don, is you got to have those conversations before that RFP hits the streets, right?
Yes.
Because then if you come in, there's no way to negotiate in the answers that you provide and everything that you're talking about. So I love what you're talking about because it really solidifies that need to have pre-conversations, pre-RFP conversations.
I love that you said that because that's huge in our world, in the pre-sales world, it is discovery.
Yeah. Yes.
Because traditionally, pre-sales people, it's all been about doing a demonstration, a live demonstration. And the salesperson, here's my technical colleague who will show you, move the mouse around and click things and show you how the technology works. And that was good. And some companies still do that, but it's really that's like 10 years ago. If you're going back to what we talked about before, buyers want something different from technical people. They really want kind of advice. In one direction, we'd use the word influencing, but they don't want to know that they're being influenced. In their direction, they're kind of looking for advice from people who are, credible and authoritative on the technology and trust, can build rapport about the technology and the industry that they're in, and have got obviously good people and communication skills as well to kind of feed into all that.
Yeah. That's really important. So I love that we're having that conversation. Something else you said earlier that I want to go back to is that you were talking about how you can there's two things that you talked about. I'm going to go to both of them, but one was that you can kind of redirect in your response. So, negotiation seems hard if we're thinking about, okay, we're writing a response to a question that they've already given us, but you can still negotiate in that answer. It's a balance and it's a nuance, but I love how you talked about how you can take that answer and answer the question, but kind of almost redirect them to something else. It's almost like you're silently coaching them. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. That's this classic, what did we call it? You can't, so it's an RFP answer where you can't say yes, because remember as well, proposals and certainly RFQs, you're commercially bound by the answers to these. Yes. So you can't guess these. You can't kind of go, well, I mean, you're obviously not going to lie, but you can't stretch the truth either, because this will come back and, excuse the expression, bite you on the bum.
Yes, absolutely.
Because, I've been involved in a lot of deals where we closed the deal and I don't know, months later, people went back to RFP and they said, well, hold on a minute. You said it was going to do this and it quite obviously doesn't. And that's a surefire way of souring a relationship. And and certainly in the technology world, a lot of the time we're into what's called subscription selling or consumption selling. And the problem is it's very easy for people to just go, well, we'll just not pay for it anymore. So they come to next year, they don't pay next year's subscription, and that's you lost. It costs you a lot of money to gain that client in the first place. We're going back to that yes. So essentially, you're in this position where I can't actually say yes to this because they put yes or no in a comment. So I can't say yes, but I don't actually want to say no either. What I want to do is say, if I was allowed to, I'd say, you're asking the wrong question.
Love it. And that happens often, right? Because you've had maybe no influence on the front end of the RFP and you're like, they don't know what they're asking here. People get mad about that all the time. So I love this. Yeah.
So a classic one in the tech world would be, well, we can't actually do that, but we work with a partner who does do it. So the way to answer it then is so you've got to say yes or no. And, if there's a maybe or a halfway thing, you'd go for that. But then actually, if you think about what you do next, is you are negotiating, because you'd say, okay, we can't do it the way you've asked for it, or we don't have that functionality ourselves, but we work with this other partner. Now, if you just said that and left it, you kind of, when people are looking at RFP and go, well, that's a no, isn't it? Why didn't you just say no, you can't do it? So what you got to do is you got to say, we work with this other partner. the advantage to you is this,
Ooh,
and
I
it,
love
which is
that.
then you move into, you're kind of negotiating that, okay, that's not what you wanted. You wanted us to provide the functionality, but by working with this partner, you'd get these other added benefits. So that you're actually in a value exchange there, which is, okay, we can't do what you want, but look what, by doing it this other way, look what extra you get. So it's always, there's this subtle extra bit you need to, I think, put in those kind of answers, because it's the classic one. I always get it down to that thing. You can't say yes, but you don't want to say no. It's those answers. If you think about them, anything you answer after that, you're gonna say, we have this other way of doing it, or maybe what you don't want to do is say something like, and that's going to be in next version.
Yeah.
That's SOX compliance. I think will be all over you if you did that. But I think people like Salesforce are not actually allowed to do that at all. But it's that negotiation piece, is understanding what would the value be to them, and this idea of a value exchange, which is, it's give and get. They're not getting what they want. So what can you give them, and how can you spin it to look like it's more value to them? And that's negotiating.
Brilliant. Yeah, I love that. The other thing you said that I want to come back to is you were talking about coaching kind of on the front end before the RFP comes back. So I want to dig a little bit deeper in that. But before we do that, I want to take a quick break for a quick commercial.
You're listening to the RFP Success Show with Lisa REHUREK. If you're filling your scratch pad with takeaways from today's episode, let's talk. Gain an outside perspective about your RFP process and learn about how we're assisting clients with consistently high win rates. Book a call with us at the rfpsuccesscompany.com.
All right, everybody, we are back with the RFP Success Show and Don Carmichael. We are talking all about negotiation skills, and he's already given us some great golden nuggets. So Don, before the break, we talked about, you had mentioned the word coaching, and I kind of honed in on that because I'd never actually heard somebody use that term in this context. So if we're talking about, again, kind of pre-RFP, before the RFP hits the deck, right? We want to be in there having conversations so that we can, what we usually say is so that we can influence that RFP itself, right? But you talked about coaching, and I love this so much, but I wonder if you can help our listeners. And I'm just tossing this question out to you, so I'm hoping that I'm not throwing you under the bus here, but how does somebody get into a company to really start that conversation and become that? It's got to be a trusted relationship, right? To be able to get that coaching conversation going, to coach them into what they want. For our listeners, how do they even get that conversation started?
Do you know what? That is so interesting these days, because a hyper modern piece of research, I think it only came out like in the last week, and it's related to something called the jolt effect, which may come back to later. When a lot of tech companies looked at where do their leads come from, their marketing engines look at, someone tapped on a button on the website, or there was some kind of social thing. And a recent piece of research has said, actually, that's the wrong place to put all your money. Where people are actually starting conversations with your company is things like this: a podcast, webinars, social posting. Is certainly in complex things, they're already looking for people who are knowledgeable, that they can, trust, that one step removed, as it were. So the relationships are already being built through content like this before buyers actually kind of elect to put their hand up. So the idea about, who gets to coach them is they've already decided some of this from some of the content that they've consumed. Another aspect to this is that, unfortunately, there's a lot of content out there. Anyone goes on, your website, competitor's website, there's probably lots and lots. There's white papers there. There's, there's loads and loads of different content. And the other perspective with this is that buyers are confused. They're just overwhelmed by all of this. And there's been research where they've pulled out this name called the first person who can create some sense from all of this content and say, this is what's important. Of course, what you said, what you're doing is actually starting to coach the buyer, but you need to establish some level of credibility beforehand. So, some people are very good at doing that at the first kind of touch point, as it were. But I think we're moving into this world where people have already made their mind up about you through content like this, a podcast or through social. So, so the ability to coach someone may be established long before they even meet you. And at that point, you have the credibility. Maybe they don't want to use the word coach, but you can advise them. So the coaching comes into it because many people who are buying technology have never bought whatever it is, that type of technology before. Or if they have, it probably was done in a completely different way.
Or they screwed it up so bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Or it was a really bad experience the last time. So the coaching comes in that what is it a buyer really wants is really someone who can anticipate all of what are the steps going to be that they're going to have to go through. But being, honest and open about it, which is, you're in a larger company, client that you're buying, and at some stage your procurement team will want you to go through and, that you've actually thoroughly looked through and compared, let's say, different vendors. So at this point, there'll be an RFP. So don't be frightened of that. That's what's going to happen. And a lot of buyers, sometimes the person who's going to buy it may not even know that an RFP is part of the process until procurement or a consultant gets involved in it. So the idea of coaching is not just coaching about the product, but also what is the buying journey going to be like. And one of the things we kind of look at in the technology world is the idea that anyone signs something is actually just part of the journey to actually achieving the value or the outcome that you were actually looking for, which may be 6 months, a year further down the line. We do these things called customer journey mapping, where you're kind of looking at emotions. And sometimes when someone's actually signed a contract, that's actually one of the worst points in it, because that's when the fear kicks in from them, which is I've signed it. All the responsibility is now on that person's shoulders, and they are so, they're now absolutely reliant that you're going to deliver what you said you were going to deliver. So to what you said there, coaching, I think it is the right word, is that a lot of people, if there were a lot of buyers in the technology world, if they were truthful, they really would. They need help about what the buying journey is going to be like, and they need someone who's been through it many times before to help them anticipate the challenges they're going to have. So like a business buyer who's maybe buying like a CRM system, which hopefully a lot of people have come across, they may not know that at some point their internal IT department are going to jump on this and go, yes, but what about all the security testing? And if someone can help them anticipate that and say, your IT department are going to probably ask these questions, here's the answers to them up front. Let's not wait until later on. There's it comes as part of an RFP. Maybe we could answer some of these things up front, and that would sate that particular, department's, the information need they've got. I mean, to be honest, though, with RFPs, the whole point of RFP, though, is pulling all of these things from different departments, isn't it? There'll be perhaps a legal bit to it, an IT bit to it, there's a business bit to it, there's a commercial bit to it. Procurement will want to put their things in there, because they've got to add their value to, how the process works. So our RFPs tend to be good ways of dragging everything together.
Right. Well, it was interesting, too, because something else that I heard that you said, you shared something that 43% of complex B2B solution buyers prefer a rep-free buying experience. Ooh, so I thought that was kind of interesting. Tell me more about what that means, and then if you can relate that back to how that relates to RFPs, if you can, that'd be great.
Well, there's a challenge. Thanks, Lisa. So that research, by the way, on all of these numbers and things I'm throwing around, that it's all kind of out in the kind of ether, the internet. So these people doing this research, 43% of buyers want a rep-free experience. I mean, that's wow. Okay, that is really, and apparently it's even higher with millennials. Wow. And it all goes back to something we mentioned earlier on, which is that in the business to consumer world, no one wants to be sold to.
Yeah.
Do you remember Pac-Man? It was kind of a game.
Of course. I think we're probably similar age. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So this game, for anyone else who's not come across it, you've got to try it out. It's kind of like one of the earliest video games. So you're a person going around this, I suppose it's a maze, and there are these, I don't know, kind of ghost things that are going to come around, and you've got to avoid them, but also kind of get to these little tokens. Because if if you bump into one of these ghosts, then that's like a life over. Someone told me this great story about buying a bed, and it is to do with salespeople, and they said they went into the shop to buy a bed, and they were wandering around, and they could see out of their peripheral vision this salesperson start to approach them on one side. So they kind of moved off to the left away from them. But then there was another salesperson that was following them from behind, and they thought, "Oh, I've got to avoid them." So they started working their way around this maze of beds in this bed shop. And the analogy they said was it was like a Pac-Man playing Pac-Man, trying to avoid salespeople. And if you put that mentally in your head, people will go to extraordinary lengths not to have a salesperson, interrogate them or challenge them in any way. So that behavior has come into the business world, because basically, if you've not bought like the technology or an enterprise kind of level product before, of course you're going to bring the behaviors you've already got, which is, I don't want to be sold to. I'll desperately do anything not to have to speak to a salesperson. Because I live in the world of technology selling, we don't help ourselves either, because we sit there, we're constantly what's called qualifying people, which is, in its most basic term, this is a really old one, is a thing called BANT, which is, we're constantly, do you have budget? Have you got the authority to do this? Or are you, is there a need there? And what timing? And timing always turns out to be the most important thing. Is, why would you want to do this project now? And if you haven't got an answer to that, you don't get any further. So a business developer will just close you down and maybe put you on a list, and you get some emails. That's about all you're going to get from the technology company. So you can understand that why a lot of people would prefer to do a rep, not to have to speak to a salesperson. But that doesn't mean that they don't want kind of information. They do want access to information, and they also are going to be, stressed. There are 2 or 3 potential products here that we could buy. How do I choose between them? An RFP, in a way, is also part of this rep-free thing, isn't it? Because a lot of way that clients work, RFPs, is they kind of deny you any access to do any kind of discovery. It's, we put all this work into an RFP. It's got everything that you need in there. You need to answer it in the way that we ask. And giving access to be able to do discovery, you've got to be careful with that, because is it giving preferential treatment to one vendor over another? So you've got to be understood about that. So I think RFPs can fit into this world of, I don't want to be sold to, because it's also a way of fending off salespeople who are trying to influence you, isn't it? So an RFP works really well in that world.
Yeah, you know what else is interesting about that, though? And I've said this to numerous people, because people always hate RFPs, right? Like, RFP. And I'm like, look, everything that you need to pre-qualify a sale is already pre-qualified when an RFP hits the deck, right? They have a budget. You might not like the budget, but they've got a budget. They've got a need. They've got a timeline. All of that stuff that when you're in sales and you're trying to pre-qualify, that's already pre-qualified. Now you've got to build the trust and show them that you're the right ones. And that's the job in the RFP response. But it is, to what you said, it's a great way for state governments or corporations to say, we don't want to talk to you, but respond to this RFP. So that another reason why you got to get it in on the front end, and you're not selling on the front end, you're building a relationship and just getting them to know you, so that when you do respond to that RFP. And, I also always say that there's a lot of trust that you have to build in that response. And, I have one last question for you here before we wrap, but what is the most powerful buyer emotion that you see as a salesperson, as a negotiation expert? What is the most powerful buyer emotion?
Absolutely, I love that question, because we've already partially mentioned some of this, which is that a lot of sales methodologies that are out there that salespeople use, they emphasize kind of fear and pain, and use quite negative words. And the rationale behind that is you're looking for the client's pain, is because that will motivate them to do something to alleviate the pain. Well, again, going back to some recent research, it turns out that doesn't work anymore, using fear. All it does is actually drives people to make no decision. So this was a load of analysis. Paralyzes them, because they're already fearful of making a decision, and to ratchet it up by making them even more fearful doesn't get you anywhere at all. There's book that's only come out in the last few weeks called Jolts, that's done a lot of research that looking into the language of how remote selling works. Because basically, if you think of like a Zoom or a Google Meet call, you can record these, you can run natural language processing over the top to find the words, and then you can run machine language learning over the top of that and find out, what do people say at what point, what words do they use, what emotions are they trying to drive, and then what you can do is match that to the CRM outcome, which is it closed won, is it closed lost. So what they've drawn out of that is that it's not working driving that negative emotion. It's much better to drive hope. So hope is such a, it's a much more, it's a stronger word than fear. If you're a salesperson, you've been taught to kind of drive the fear. It's not working. There is statistical evidence. All it's doing is driving no decision. A lot of people hide that in sales because they kind of go, well, we lost it. It's closed lost. Yeah. But there's once that's analyzed with what actually happened, what was the behavior of the buyer, it's really high percentage of those are just, they've not been lost at all. It's just no decision. Remember, no decision is not the same as consciously staying with the status quo, as in whatever we've got at the moment, staying with it. That's a conscious decision. It's these people they're so fearful, can't make any decision at all. And who's going to, put their head above the parapet and do something that could be potentially career limiting? So, we're doing it the wrong way around. It's got to be about hope.
I love that. I love it being about hope. So that is a great thing to build into the RFP responses too. So Don, this has been so fantastic. I so appreciate you being here. Now you have a podcast of your own. Tell our listeners a little bit more about that and where they can find that.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
It's called Two PreSales in a Pod. And it's I told you about this umbrella term called pre-sales, which is the technical sales engineers, solution consultants, architects, engineers. It's the technical selling arm. And we've done, 58 episodes we've got to, so nowhere near number of your episode, Lisa.
I'm older than you, Don. There we have it.
And we talk about the challenges of the role, but we also have lots of guests, similar to yourself, who've got, different perspectives and who, challenge us. And we have lots of discussions in the podcasts about, how to respond to these challenges. And also we do a lot of discussion about something I mentioned earlier, which is a thing called buyer enablement. And now that is dramatically changing the role of how you go about doing sales in a kind of modern technology world.
Wonderful. Well, we'll have a link to your podcast in the show notes, along with ways to get in touch with you through your LinkedIn profile and your website. So that will all be in the show notes for everybody.
Thank you.
Again, Don, thank you so much for being here. Do you have any last words or any last thoughts for our listeners?
I was just going to tell a little story, right? Remember, I really don't like answering RFPs. I have a colleague, I'm not going to mention his name because he still works in the technology industry. But when we used to work together, we used to randomly put the word sausages in our RFP responses to see if anyone noticed. And in, I think, about 4 or 5 years of work with him and hundreds of RFP responses, no one ever spotted it.
That is hilarious.
It's true. It is true. He put them in. No one ever. I think maybe what happened was they spotted it and just thought it was some kind of weird, kind of like
autocorrect.
Autocorrect thing. Yeah. But no one ever came back and said, "What? I thought you were selling technology, not sausages."
That is pretty funny. That's funny. Well, thank you again for being here. To all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you find value in this podcast, please share this with your colleagues. We appreciate you. And thank you again for listening to the RFP Success Show.
This has been another episode of the RFP Success Show with Lisa REHUREK, 8-time author, speaker, and CEO of the RFP Success Company. Thank you for joining us. If you have feedback on today's episode, email us at podcast@rfpsuccess.com. No matter your business size, industry, if you have an in-house RFP team or need outside support, the RFP Success Company helps increase RFP win ratios by 10, 20, and even 50%. Learn more at the rfpsuccesscompany.com.